The well on Asa Merrow's land had been dying for 3 years before the town ever noticed, and by the time anyone spoke of it aloud, it was already too late to save with prayer alone. He kept this fact the way he kept most things: close, unspoken, folded into the daily labor of a man who had learned that talking about trouble did not fix it. Every morning, he walked the same worn path from the house to the well house, lowered the same tin bucket into the same narrowing dark, and pulled up less water than the day before. The valley called Coldwater Flats had taken its name from a spring that once ran so cold it ached the teeth, and for 2 generations the Merrow well had been the deepest and surest in the county. Now it coughed up mud more often than water, and Asa had stopped mentioning it to anyone but the well itself, murmuring to the stone lip in the mornings the way another man might murmur to a horse he was about to put down. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders from work rather than vanity, and known throughout Coldwater Flats as a man who could be relied upon and not much else. If you want to know what kind of man he was, know this: every unmarried woman within a day's ride had at some point found a reason to bring pie to his porch, or linger by the feed store when his wagon came in, or ask after his health with more attention than health required. He answered them all the same way: politely, briefly, with his hat in his hand and his eyes already drifting back toward the field or the fence or the well that was dying under his boots. They called him proud. His neighbor Emmett Coy, who ran the mill and said aloud what other men only thought, called him something closer to the truth one evening over fence posts and tobacco. "You're not proud," Emmett said. "You're just already spent on something. Man can't court a girl when all his attention's buried in the ground." Asa didn't answer that. He rarely answered the true things. Stay with this story, because the woman who finally caught Asa Merrow's attention did not come to town in a good dress or with a soft laugh. She came in a mud-spattered wagon with a toolbox older than she was, and she was not looking for a husband at all. She was running from one. His father had dug that well by hand the summer before Asa was born, and had told the story so many times that Asa could recite it without feeling it anymore. The way a man recites a prayer worn smooth by repetition. Struck water at 40 feet, deep and cold and endless. Or so it had seemed for 20 years. When his father died, quietly, in the same bed he'd been born in, 3 winters back, Asa had inherited the farm, the debts that came with it, and an old tin cup that had hung on a nail by the well house door for as long as anyone could remember. His father had used it to test the water each spring. Asa kept using it, not from superstition, but because the alternative was admitting that some things his father had done were now simply his to do, forever alone. The well had begun to fail the same season his father died, and Asa had never said this aloud to another living soul, because saying it made it sound like the land itself had noticed there was no one left to hand it down to. He tried what any practical man would try. He deepened the shaft himself over 2 brutal months, coming up each evening coated in a clay that took 3 washings to shift. He hired the Tanner brothers, who claimed to know the ground better than anyone, and paid them for 4 days of work that left the well no better and considerably poorer. He walked to the county seat twice to ask after men who called themselves water finders, diviners, drillers, men with brass rods and confident manners, and each of them looked at his dwindling cash and his stubborn expression and quoted a price that would have cost him the farm to save the farm. He wrote 1 letter, finally, at the urging of a stranger passing through, who mentioned a name almost in passing: a driller down in the river counties. Unusual reputation, unusual methods, unusually good. Asa was not a man who wrote letters easily. He composed it 3 times before he judged it plain enough to send, describing the depth of the original well, the season it had begun to fail, the mineral taste that had crept into what water remained, and closing with a line he crossed out twice before leaving it in. I have exhausted what I know how to do." He did not expect an answer. Men who wrote back promptly were men without enough work to keep them occupied, and the description he'd heard suggested otherwise. So when the reply came 6 weeks later, short, businesslike, signed only N. Fenwick, he read it twice before he let himself believe it, and a third time before he let himself hope. Arriving the second week of the month if the roads allow. Will need to see the well before naming a price. Do not fill it with anything in the meantime. N. Fenwick. He did not know, reading that letter by lamplight at his kitchen table, that the woman who wrote it was running from a debt disguised as a promise, and that the well she was coming to save would end up, in its own slow and stubborn way, saving them both. She arrived on a gray morning in early autumn, with rain threatening but not yet falling, driving her own wagon down the rutted lane that led to the Marrow place. And Asa's first thought, watching from the barn door, was that he had misread the letter. That N. Fenwick must be a father, an uncle, someone whose daughter or niece had been sent ahead with the tools while the man himself followed on a later coach. He was wrong, and she corrected him within the first minute of speaking, without any particular heat, the way a person corrects an error in arithmetic. "You're expecting someone else," she said, climbing down before he could offer a hand, which was fortunate, because he hadn't thought to offer it. "I get that most places. I'm Nora Fenwick. You wrote about a well." She was younger than he'd guessed from the letter's plain hand, perhaps 26, 27, with dark hair pulled back hard enough to mean business rather than fashion, and sleeves already rolled to the elbow, though she'd been driving all morning in the cold. Her eyes were the kind that assessed rather than admired, moving over the house, the barn, the slope of the land, in the manner of someone pricing a job rather than meeting a stranger. She did not offer him a smile, and he found, to his private confusion, that he did not miss it. "I wrote about a well," he agreed. "Didn't say I was expecting a woman to fix it." "Most people don't," she said. "Doesn't change what needs fixing." She walked past him toward the well house, without waiting to be shown, which told him two things immediately: that she had read his letter carefully enough to know the layout he'd described, and that she was not a woman who waited for permission to begin work she'd already been hired to do. He followed her, more out of habit than authority, and stood at a respectful distance while she circled the well twice, knelt at its lip, and lowered a stone, tied to a length of marked cord, into the dark. 41 feet to water, she said, more to herself than to him. "And it's not empty, it's blocked." "Blocked," he repeated. "Something's shifted below the strike point. Could be silt, could be a collapse in the vein feeding it. I won't know until I'm down there." Down there. He looked at the narrow stone throat of the well, the darkness that had swallowed 2 of his own attempts and left him gasping and empty-handed at the surface, and felt something close to alarm. "Men have gone down that shaft before," he said. "Grown men. It didn't go well for them." She looked up at him then, the first time she'd met his eyes directly since arriving, and there was neither offense nor amusement in her expression. Only a kind of patient certainty that he would later come to recognize as the truest thing about her. "I'm not most men," she said, "and I don't go down blind." She was as good as her word. Over the following days, Asa watched her work with an attentiveness he normally reserved for weather, and he came, slowly, to understand that what she practiced was not luck dressed up as a trade, but something closer to a discipline. Reading the color of clay, brought up on a probe, measuring the temperature of stone at different depths with a bare palm, listening, actually listening, at the well's mouth for some shift in the air that told her water was moving somewhere below. She refused his help the first day, accepted it grudgingly the second, and by the third, was directing him with the brisk economy of someone who had decided he was competent enough not to require managing. "Hold the rope steady. Not tight. steady. There's a difference. He learned the difference. He learned a good many things that week that he had not expected to learn, chief among them that a woman could be entirely unconcerned with whether he found her agreeable, and that this, more than any pie left on his porch, was the thing that made him watch her, longer than was strictly necessary. The town noticed her before the week was out, the way Coldwater Flats noticed everything eventually. Emmett Coy came by on the pretense of borrowing a saw blade and stayed to watch Nora Fenwick lower herself into the well shaft on a harness she'd rigged from wagon tack, disappearing into the dark with a lantern strapped to her chest and Asa above ground with both hands white-knuckled on the rope. "That's not a thing I've seen before," Emmett said, watching the rope play out. "No," Asa agreed. "You going to marry her?" Emmett asked, in the same tone he might have asked whether rain was coming. Asa did not dignify the question with an answer, though something in his chest tightened at it, in a way he chose not to examine. And a moment later, Nora's voice came up, muffled and strange from the depths, calling for more slack. And both men forgot the question entirely, in the business of keeping her safe. She came up an hour later, coated in clay to the shoulder, her face streaked, her expression fierce with the particular satisfaction of a problem understood. "There's a collapse 8 feet below the old strike," she said, accepting the water Asa handed her and drinking it without ceremony. Something above shifted and choked the vein. "It's not dead, it's buried. There's a difference, same as the rope." "Can it be cleared?" Asa asked, and heard in his own voice something he hadn't allowed himself to hear in 3 years. The shape of real hope, thin and unfamiliar. "It can," she said. "It'll take time, and it won't be gentle work, and I won't lie to you and say there's no risk in it. But it can." He looked at her then, really looked, in the gray afternoon light with clay on her jaw, and exhaustion plain in the set of her shoulders, and understood, with the sudden clarity of a man recognizing something he had been circling for days without naming, that he had stopped thinking of her as a stranger sometime between the first day and this one, and had started thinking of her as someone whose good opinion he wanted to earn, which was a thing he had not wanted from another living person since before his father died. He said none of this. He only nodded and told her supper would be ready within the hour, and went to see about it, and if his hands were unsteady chopping the vegetables, it was a thing he did not mention to anyone, least of all himself. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them named, but both came to depend on. The way a body comes to depend on a season before admitting the season has changed anything. Nora took a room above the mercantile in town, arranged through Emmett's wife, who ran the place and who took an immediate and vocal liking to a woman capable of driving her own wagon and speaking her own mind in the same afternoon. Each morning, Nora walked the mile out to the Marrow farm with her tools slung over one shoulder. And each morning, Asa found some reason to be near the well house before she arrived, though he would have denied, if asked, that this was anything more than a farmer's ordinary schedule. They worked. That was the plain truth of those weeks, stripped of anything a gossip might have wanted to hear. They cleared collapsed stone from the shaft bucket by bucket, reinforced the crumbling walls with timber Asa cut and shaped himself, and inched downward toward the buried vein with the patience of people who understood that haste was how wells and men both got ruined. Nor directed the technical work with an authority that brooked no argument, and Asa, who had commanded his own farm alone for 3 years and answered to no one, found he did not mind taking direction from her, which surprised him more than it should have. They ate the noon meal together most days, seated on upturned buckets near the well house with bread and whatever the larder offered, and it was here, in these unremarkable hours, that Asa learned the particular shape of her, not through declarations, which she seemed constitutionally unable to make, but through the small unguarded things that surfaced when a person's hands are busy and their mind has wandered elsewhere. She had learned the trade from her father, she told him once, watching a hawk work the thermals above the ridge rather than looking at him as she spoke. He'd had no sons and no patience for the idea that a daughter couldn't learn what a son would have been taught. He died 4 years back. She said this the way she said most things, flatly, as a fact to be recorded rather than mourned aloud. But Asa noticed the way her hand stilled on the bread when she said it, and he recognized that stillness, because he carried a version of it himself. "My father dug this well," he offered, after a silence long enough that she might have thought the subject closed. "Told the story of it so many times I could recite it in my sleep. Struck water at 40 feet, and thought he'd struck something that would outlast him." "Nothing outlasts anybody," Nora said. "Not really. It just keeps working after we stop." He turned that over for a long moment. It was, he would think later, one of the truest things anyone had ever said to him, and she had said it the way she said everything, without evident awareness that she'd said anything remarkable at all. He noticed other things too, in the accumulating small hours of those weeks. He noticed that she wrote letters of her own in the evenings. He'd seen her once through the mercantile window, bent over paper by lamplight with an expression of concentration that looked more like dread than correspondence usually inspired. He noticed that when a rider passed through town one afternoon, a stranger asking after the road south, Nora had gone very still at the mercantile counter and not relaxed again until the man had ridden on. He noticed that she never spoke of family beyond the father she'd already mentioned. Never spoke of where she'd come from before Coldwater Flats. Never spoke of where she intended to go once the well was finished. He was not a man given to prying. He had spent 3 years being the subject of the town's curiosity and had come to value, above most things, a person's right to keep their own counsel. But he noticed, and noticing, for a man like Asa Marrow, was its own kind of attention, the only kind he knew how to give freely. It was Emmett, predictably, who said aloud what Asa had only observed. "She's running from something," Emmett said one evening, the two of them leaning on the fence while Nora's lantern moved inside the well house, cutting stripes of gold across the yard. "Woman like that, alone, no family mentioned, jumping at strangers on the road. That's not a person building a life. That's a person avoiding one." "Might be none of our business," Asa said, though the words came out less certain than he intended. "Might not," Emmett agreed. "Don't mean it won't become your business, if you keep looking at her the way you've been looking at her." Asa did not answer that either, but he carried the words with him into the following weeks the way a man carries a splinter he has not yet found time to dig out, small, persistent, impossible to entirely ignore. The first real crack in Nora's composure came on an evening in late autumn, when a letter arrived for her at the mercantile bearing a seal Asa did not recognize, and a hand he did. The same careful, deliberate script he'd glimpsed once on an envelope she'd tucked away too quickly for casual sight. He was in town that day collecting feed, and he happened to be standing near the counter when Emmett's wife handed the letter across, remarking, without any particular malice, that it was the third one that month from the same sender, wasn't it? Nora took the letter with a hand that did not quite hide its unsteadiness, and thanked Emmett's wife in a voice pitched carefully level, and left the mercantile without opening it, walking fast enough that Asa, following a respectful distance behind on his own errands, had to lengthen his stride to keep her in sight without appearing to follow her at all. He found her 20 minutes later, at the edge of town, near the old bridge, standing with the letter still sealed in her hand, and her eyes fixed on the water running beneath, and something in the set of her shoulders told him this was not a moment for questions, however much he wanted to ask them. He said only, "You don't have to read it today." She looked up at him, and for one unguarded instant, he saw something in her face he had not seen there before. Not fear exactly, but the exhaustion of a person who has been running long enough that stillness itself feels dangerous. No, she agreed. I don't. She did not open it that day, nor the next, and Asa did not ask again, though he noticed she carried it with her after that, tucked inside her coat as though the mere proximity of it were a kind of vigilance she couldn't set down. The well work continued through this quiet undercurrent of unspoken worry, and it was perhaps 3 weeks later, on a bright cold morning with frost still silvering the fence posts, that the shaft nearly took her life and gave Asa, in the space of 30 terrible seconds, an understanding of his own feelings that no amount of quiet observation had managed to provide. They had reached by then within a few feet of the buried vein Nora had promised was there, and the work had grown correspondingly delicate, clearing loosened stone by hand rather than by bucket, testing each section of the shaft wall before trusting weight to it. Nora had gone down that morning as she had gone down dozens of times before, harness secured, lantern lit, calling up periodic reports of progress that Asa had learned to listen for with half his attention while he tended the rope. The half attention was not enough that morning to prepare him for the sudden violent slack that told him the wall had given way beneath her before her voice did. He would remember, afterward, very little of the next several minutes in coherent order. Only fragments, sharp and disordered, the way memory preserves genuine terror rather than ordinary event. The rope going taut again with a jerk that nearly took his footing. Her voice, thin and strained but present, calling up that she was caught. Not falling, caught, and that he should not, under any circumstance, pull the rope until she said so, because pulling wrong could bring the rest of the wall down on her. His own voice, unfamiliar to his ears, calling back that he understood, that he was there, that she should tell him what she needed, and he would do it exactly. He worked for what felt like an hour, and was in truth, perhaps 15 minutes, following her instructions precisely as she called them up through the dark, easing tension here, giving slack there until at last her weight shifted fully onto the rope and he hauled her up hand over hand with a strength he had not known he possessed, some reserve of it kept back for exactly this kind of necessity. She emerged coated in fresh clay, one arm bleeding from a scrape along stone, breathing hard but steady, and the first thing she said, once she'd cleared the well's lip and stood on solid ground again, was a report on the structural condition of the shaft, delivered in the same flat professional register she used for everything. Asa did not hear a word of it. He had pulled her the last few feet bodily, without meaning to, and now stood with both hands still gripping her shoulders as though letting go might undo the fact of her safety. And it was only when she stopped speaking and looked at him with an expression of faint surprise that he realized how he must appear, a man undone by something he had not permitted himself to name. "You're shaking," she observed. "So are you," he said, which was true, though for entirely different reasons, and for a long moment neither of them moved, standing in the cold morning light with clay and blood between them and something else. Besides, something neither of them had words ready for. "I thought," Asa said finally, and stopped, because the sentence that wanted to come out was larger than he was prepared to say aloud to a woman who had known him for 2 months and had never once given him reason to think she wanted more from him than competent labor and a fair wage. "I know what you thought," Nora said quietly. "It was the same thing I thought. Going down." It was not a declaration. It was, in its way, the truest thing she had said to him yet, an admission delivered with the same plain economy she gave everything. And Asa understood, standing there with her blood drying faint and dark on his sleeve, that whatever this was between them had stopped, sometime in the last 15 terrible minutes, being something either of them could pretend not to notice. They did not speak of it further that day. She tended her arm herself, refusing his offer to ride for the doctor with a firmness that told him the subject was closed, and the work resumed the following morning as though nothing had shifted, though something plainly had. A new carefulness in the way they moved around each other, a new weight to silences that had previously been merely comfortable. It was into this fragile, unnamed understanding that the sealed letter finally opened 10 days later, and with it came the truth Nora Fenwick had been carrying since long before she ever drove her wagon down the rutted lane to Asamero's dying well. She told him on an evening when the first real snow of the season had begun to fall, sitting across from him at his kitchen table with the letter open between them and her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She did not drink. "I should have told you when I arrived," she said. "I told myself there was no need, since I intended to finish the work and move on before it mattered. I was wrong about that, and I think you already know I was wrong, so I'll just tell you plainly." Asa said nothing. He had learned, in the months of her company, that she needed silence in which to gather difficult things, and he gave it to her now, though every instinct in him wanted to reach across the table and still the tremor he could see in her hands despite the cup's warmth. "My father's business failed before he died," she said. "Wells, same as this one, all across 3 counties. And toward the end, he took money he shouldn't have taken from a man named Jasper Coyle to keep the work going. Coyle's not a patient creditor. When my father died, the debt came to me, because there was no one else left to claim it against, and Coyle made it plain the debt could be settled 2 ways. Money I didn't have, or marriage to him, which would settle it entirely, since a wife's debts become a husband's concern and cease conveniently to be owed at all." Asa's jaw had gone tight sometime during this recitation, though he had not noticed it happening. "That's not a debt," he said. "That's a leash." "It's both," Nora said. "I've spent 4 years traveling from job to job, taking whatever well work would have me, saving what I can toward the sum, staying ahead of the letters when I could and answering them with delay when I couldn't. He writes every few months to remind me the offer stands. This last letter says he's grown tired of waiting, and that he intends to come collect an answer in person, sooner rather than later." "Here," Asa said. "Though how much?" he asked. She told him the figure, and it was, he understood immediately, a sum that would have strained even a farm, considerably more prosperous than his. A sum he could not raise without selling land he could not afford to sell, not with the bank's note still hanging over the property and the well, only now beginning, cautiously, to yield water again after months of unpaid labor toward that very end. "I'm not telling you this, so you'll offer to pay it," Nora said, watching his face with the plain directness that had never once, in all their weeks together, failed him. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you've let live in your town for 2 months, and what's likely to come find her here before the season's out. I don't regret it," Asa said, "whatever comes of it. I don't regret a single week." "That's kind of you to say," Nora said, and something in her voice suggested she did not entirely believe kindness would be sufficient to what was coming. And the snow continued to fall outside the window, soft and steady and entirely indifferent to the debts and reckonings of the people beneath it. Jasper Coyle arrived in Coldwater Flats 11 days later, on a horse too fine for the muddy roads and in a coat too fine for the season, and the town noticed him the way it noticed everything, which is to say, immediately and with considerable appetite, for whatever story his arrival implied. He was, Asa saw at once, a man accustomed to being accommodated, the kind whose confidence came not from any particular merit but from the long habit of money smoothing every obstacle before he had to encounter it directly. He inquired at the mercantile after a woman named Fenwick with the easy assurance of a man who expected, and generally received, prompt and complete information, and within the hour the whole of Coldwater Flats knew that the well driller staying above the store was owed for elsewhere, and owed for by a man who did not appear inclined to leave without collecting. He found her, in the end, at the Merrow Well House, where she and Asa were finishing the timber reinforcement that would, within days, allow the cleared vein below to run freely again for the first time in 3 years. Coyle did not dismount immediately. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard for a long moment, taking in the scene. The woman coated in work dust, the farmer beside her, the well itself half restored, with an expression that suggested he was already calculating what all of it meant and did not much like the sum. "Nora," he said, when he finally swung down. "You've been difficult to locate." "I haven't been hiding," Nora said, though the stillness in her posture said otherwise. "I've been working." "So I see," Coyle said, his gaze moving to Asa, with the frank appraisal of a man assessing a rival's assets. "And I take it, this is the latest arrangement." "There's no arrangement," Asa said, before Nora could answer for herself, and his voice carried a flatness that surprised even him. "She's here to fix a well, that's the whole of it." "Is it?" Coyle said, and something in his tone made clear he did not believe this and did not much care whether Asa did either. "Perhaps you should know, before you form any further opinions on the matter, what Miss Fenwick owes and to whom." He told it plainly, standing in Asa's own yard with the ease of a man reading a ledger aloud, sparing nothing, the sum, the years of avoidance, the offer that stood as the only settlement she had ever been given. He told it, Asa understood, precisely because he intended it as a wound, a public unmaking of whatever privacy Nora had managed to preserve, delivered in front of the one man in Coldwater Flats. She seemed to have let close enough to matter. Nora did not flinch through any of it, though Asa, watching her carefully, saw the cost of that stillness in the whitening of her knuckles where they gripped the timber brace she'd been holding. "You've said your piece," she said, when Coyle finished. "Now say what you actually came to say." "I came to collect," Coyle said. "Money or marriage, same as it's always been. I'd have thought 4 years of running would have tired you of the choice. But if you'd rather keep running, I've grown patient enough to follow." "I'll pay the debt," Asa said. The words left him before he'd finished deciding to say them, and he felt Nora's eyes come to him sharp and startled, and he felt, too, the full weight of what he'd just offered. A sum he did not have, against land already mortgaged past comfort, for a woman who had given him no promise beyond the plain honesty of her company. Coyle's eyebrows rose with theatrical interest. And how, precisely, does a well-digger's client propose to raise a sum like that? "I understand this valley's had trouble even feeding itself these last seasons." "I'll find a way," Asa said. Though even as he said it, he understood the impossibility plainly enough. The bank would not extend him further credit. The land was worth less than the debt already against it, and the only asset he possessed that might approach the sum was the farm itself, which meant offering to pay. Nora's debt was, in practical terms, offering to lose everything his father had built in order to buy her freedom from a man he had known for less than an hour. Nora set down the brace she'd been holding and stepped between the two men with the particular calm of someone who had made a decision and did not intend to be argued out of it. "You'll do no such thing," she said to Asa, not unkindly, but without any room for negotiation. "I didn't come here to trade one debt for a bigger one on someone else's back." She turned to Coyle. "I'll have the sum myself in time. I've been saving toward it for 4 years, and I'll finish saving toward it, however long that takes, and you can write me every month until I do. But you will not stand in this man's yard and use my debt to bargain for his land." Coyle's expression flickered, some genuine surprise passing briefly across the practiced composure. "You'd rather keep running than let a man help you?" "I'd rather pay my own debts," Nora said. "There's a difference, though I don't expect you to see it." She turned then to Asa, and something in her face, the fierce, guarded gratitude of it, told him more plainly than any declaration could have that his offer had landed exactly where he'd meant it, even though she would not permit herself to accept it. "Give me until spring," she said to Coyle. "I'll have the money by spring, or I'll have nothing to offer you at all, and you can do what you like with that answer." Coyle studied her for a long moment, and then Asa, and something calculating passed behind his eyes. The look of a man recognizing that force had failed, and patience might yet succeed where force had not. "Spring, then," he said finally. "But understand, Miss Fenwick, that my patience has a bottom to it same as any well, and I've been drawing on it a long while now." He mounted his horse without further ceremony. "I'll write." He rode out of the yard the way he'd ridden in, unhurried, and the two of them stood in the settling quiet of his absence, with the half-restored well between them and a question neither had yet found words to ask. Winter closed over Coldwater Flats hard and early that year, and it was into that long white season that Asa Merrow made the decision that would define, more than any words he ever managed to say, the shape of what he felt. He did not tell Nora what he intended, which was, he understood, even as he did it, its own small betrayal of the honesty they'd built between them these past months. But he judged, rightly or not, that she would refuse him outright if given the chance, and he had watched her stand in his yard and choose 4 more years of running, rather than accept a debt paid on her behalf. And he did not intend to argue her out of that pride, so much as to make the argument unnecessary. He rode to the county seat, twice that winter, matters he explained to Nora only as farm business, which was not strictly a lie. He sold, over the course of those 2 trips, the northern parcel of grazing land his father had purchased the year before Asa was born, land that had never been essential to the farm's operation, but had been kept, out of sentiment more than necessity, as part of what the Merrow name still held in the valley. He sold 2 horses he could ill afford to lose come planting season, and the good wagon in favor of the old one, and a collection of tools his father had left him that a traveling buyer offered a fair price for, more out of respect for the Merrow name than any real need of the tools themselves. He did not tell Emmett what he was doing, though Emmett, watching the wagon leave twice that winter, loaded with things it should not have needed to carry, guessed enough of it to say, "One evening at the fence, you're selling off your father's farm to pay another man's debt on a woman who won't take your name yet, and Asa, you understand that's the kind of thing men regret." "I understand it," Asa said. "I'm doing it anyway." "Why?" Emmett asked, though the question was gentler than it might have been, more curious than critical. "Because the well came back," Asa said after a moment, and it was not really an answer to the question Emmett had asked, but it was the truest thing he had to offer. 3 years it sat there dying, and I dug and I paid men and I prayed over it, and none of it brought back so much as a cupful. And then she came, and inside 2 months there's water running cold and clear, same as my father always said there'd be. I don't pretend to understand everything a person owes another person for a thing like that, but I know I'm not the kind of man who watches somebody save what's his, and then lets somebody else buy her back like a debt on a ledger. Emmett had no answer to that, and did not try to find one, and the 2 men stood at the fence a while longer, in a silence that said, better than words could have, everything Emmett had come to understand about his neighbor over the course of that long winter. By the time the first thaw came, easing the frost from the fence posts and softening the mud along the lane, Asa had raised the full sum Nora owed, and had done it in a manner quiet enough that she did not learn of it, not from him, and not from Emmett, who kept his own counsel on the matter with unusual discipline. Until the morning, a rider arrived from the county seat, bearing not a demand from Jasper Coyle, but a receipt. She found Asa at the well, drawing up the tin cup his father had used for testing, filled now with water so clear and cold it startled her every time she saw him drink it, and she held the receipt out to him with a hand that was not, for once, entirely steady. "You paid it," she said. "It wasn't a question. I paid it," he agreed. "Why?" she asked, And it was the same question Emmett had asked, though her voice carried none of Emmett's dry curiosity and all of something rawer beneath it. Asa set down the cup, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, because the true answer was larger than any sentence he had ever managed to construct, and he understood, standing there with the well running steady and cold between them, that the moment called for something plainer than eloquence. "Because you fixed what I couldn't," he said finally. "And because a debt like that isn't yours to carry alone anymore, if you'll let it be otherwise." Nora looked at him for a long moment, the receipt still trembling faintly in her hand, and something in her face, the guarded composure that had carried her through 4 years of running, finally, visibly, gave way. "I told Coyle I'd rather pay my own debts," she said. "I know it," Asa said. "This isn't me paying your debt, Nora. This is me asking you to stop needing to run from one." It was, in its way, the closest thing to a proposal either of them managed that morning. And it was enough. Plain, practical, entirely without ornament, and entirely true. Which was, Nora had come to understand over these months, the only kind of declaration Asa Merrow knew how to make, and the only kind she had ever actually wanted. Spring came fully to Coldwater Flats some weeks later, and with it, the kind of green that only follows a hard winter, vivid and almost startling against the thawed brown fields. Jasper Coyle did not return, having received his money by post, along with a letter from Nora that contained, by all report, exactly as many words as necessary, and not one more. The wedding, when it came, was a small affair, held at the Merrow farm itself with Emmett and his wife among the handful present. And if the town had once wondered why Asa Merrow ignored every pretty girl who ever brought pie to his porch, they wondered it no longer, watching him stand beside a woman in a plain dress with clay still faintly visible under her fingernails. Because some things, once seen clearly, require no further explanation. They built their life together in the manner they had built everything else between them, through labor rather than declaration, through the daily accumulation of small, competent acts that meant more than any speech could have. Nora took occasional work in the surrounding counties when a well-proved beyond local skill, and always came home again, and Asa never once asked her to give up the trade that had first brought her walking down his lane, understanding that the woman he loved was not one who could be kept by restriction, only by the plain fact of a home worth returning to. Years on, when their daughter was old enough to trail after her mother toward the well house each morning, small and serious and already curious about the tools she was not yet permitted to touch, Asa would sometimes stand at the kitchen window and watch them go, and think of a gray autumn morning when a woman he did not yet know had climbed down from a mud-spattered wagon and corrected his assumption about who she was, without any particular heat, the way a person corrects an error in arithmetic. The well ran clear and cold every season after that, deep and steady the way his father had always sworn it would, and the old tin cup still hung on its nail by the door, though it was his daughter's hand that reached for it most mornings now, dipping it into water that had once nearly died, and had been in the end saved by the one person in the valley who had never once tried to win Asa Merrow's attention, and had earned all of it instead.